episode is brought to you by Premensal.
The teaching of strategies is the cognitive tool that has the best evidence base. So strategies are things like using external supports to support your memory. So not trying to rely on holding everything in your head, because our working memory, how much we can juggle in our head at any one time, that's capacity limited.
Welcome back to another episode of Thriving in Menopause, brought to you by Prevention Magazine. I'm Zoe Mernier, the editor of Prevention, and we're happy to have you join us on the podcast where we talk all things women's health, hormones, and how to live well through the menopausal transition. Today, we're discussing a topic that so many women struggle with, and that's the cognitive changes that can happen during perimenopause and menopause. You know the feeling, walking into a room and forgetting why, losing your words mid-sentence, or feeling like your brain has 1,000 tabs open at once. And for women with ADHD, these hormonal shifts can add an extra layer of complexity. To help us unpack why this happens and what you can do about it, I'm joined by Associate Professor Caroline Gurvich, a leading researcher in women's cognitive health. She's going to help us separate the myths from the science and share practical strategies for supporting your brain through this stage of life. Caroline, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Zoe. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, well, let's start with the basics. When women say, I feel like I'm losing my mind, what's actually going on with cognitive function in perimenopause and menopause?
Yeah, it's a great question and a comment that happens a lot. I think there's quite a few things happening that underpin the cognitive symptoms, and I think they might vary between individuals as well. So one of the key things that happens is the change in our sex hormones. So we know that estrogen and progesterone are the sex hormones that regulate our reproductive function and have a big change during the menopause transition and perimenopausal years. So they are gradually fluctuating, particularly estrogen or estradiol, and gradually declining. So that's happening over a maybe like 4 to 10 year period during perimenopause. And then we have low levels of estradiol and progesterone once we're in postmenopause. So there's significant hormone changes, and I think they play a key role because we know that these sex hormones do a lot in the brain. So they actually cross the blood-brain barrier, and there are estrogen receptors, so parts of our brain that respond to estrogen and to progesterone, and they're located in brain areas that are really important for our cognition, our thinking skills. So there are estrogen and progesterone receptors in the front part of our brain, and that's that's kind of the home of our, what we call like our executive functions. These are our higher order cognitive skills that help us prioritize, organize, figure out all the tabs that are open in our brain and coordinate those. There's also estrogen and progesterone receptors in a part of our brain called the hippocampus, which is really important for our memory, as well as the amygdala, which is really important for our mood regulation. And these estrogen and progesterone hormones also interact with other chemicals in our brain, like dopamine and serotonin. So there's a scientific basis that the hormone changes might play a significant role in some of the cognitive symptoms for some women. But I think there's also lots of other potential factors. So we know that menopause can come with a whole range of symptoms like poor sleep or changes in mood, vasomotor symptoms, even pain, and all of those things independently can impact cognition. So I think we can't forget the role that all of those symptoms can play. But then there's also just the timing of menopause is midlife. It's a busy time in many women's lives. Women are often quite stretched and stressed. So there's that factor as well, that there's a lot going on that people are juggling in their mind. Our minds are quite full with potentially work responsibilities, home life, teenage children, elderly parents. So there's a lot that we're juggling. So that in and of itself can mean that sometimes we have moments where we forget things or we're struggling to perform at our optimal, or think at our clearest. So I think there's lots of potential factors that can underpin the cognitive symptoms. And, one of them might be hormones, either directly or indirectly.
I mean, yes, we really do have 1,000 tabs open at this time of our lives, don't we?
Yes, really nice analogy.
Now, throw ADHD into the mix and I guess life can feel even trickier. So we know that more women are being diagnosed with ADHD later in life. So is perimenopause actually related to this at all? And how do these hormonal changes during perimenopause and menopause particularly affect these women?
I'm certainly seeing clinically a lot of women presenting around perimenopausal years questioning ADHD. It's very common, and it wasn't something that was common years ago. So there is something about the perimenopause that is prompting people to explore ADHD. And I think for some women, menopause really is uncovering an ADHD that's always been there. So ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a neurodevelopmental condition or a brain type that someone has had from childhood. And it is either characterized by inattentive characteristics, which is most common in women, the inattentive presentation of ADHD. And the inattentive presentation or the inattentive characteristics or symptoms are things like forgetfulness, losing items, losing your train of thought, difficulty focusing when you don't necessarily feel like focusing. So they're things that we can experience all the time. They're not uncommon attributes. And I think that's sometimes why they can be missed. But for a diagnosis of ADHD, they have to really be pervasive, so really present in more than one setting and causing impairment, so having an impact on someone's quality of life. And so I think what happens for a lot of women around perimenopause, and what I certainly see, is sometimes there's been a diagnosis of a child, someone's child, and through that process, a woman has started to recognize some of these symptoms and has always experienced them, but hasn't really had a name for them and has kind of just struggled through and somehow managed. So I think that can sometimes be a prompt for people. Sometimes I think with menopause, we know there's a little bit of research that shows that people with ADHD during the perimenopausal transition, their ADHD gets worse and they experience a whole lot more in terms of menopause symptoms. So they're often really struggling, and whatever kind of coping mechanisms that people had used all throughout their life, it's just not cutting it anymore. So they've always had all of the ADHD symptoms and characteristics, but they've kind of managed. They've had enough support and scaffolding, and they've kind of done what we call masking, where they've put on a neurotypical face and kind of muddled through and got through, but they've just got to this point where that's not working anymore. And so there could be, again, a number of reasons, but certainly hormones, again, the hormone changes might play a role, because we know that estrogen interacts with dopamine and serotonin, and dopamine in particular is really important and plays a key role in ADHD symptoms. And so when we see estradiol like fluctuating, declining, again, that provides like a rationale as to why this might have an impact on ADHD symptoms quite directly. But again, all the other factors that we're talking about before related to menopause can also have an impact and really bring to light some of the symptoms and characteristics that people have been experiencing always.
A perfect storm. I guess, symptoms like distraction, forgetfulness, or feeling scattered, as you've said, they sound like both ADHD and menopause. So how do both women and I guess doctors sort of tease apart what's what, really?
It can be really tricky. The key is really someone's history. So it takes a fair bit of time. I spend a lot of time with someone when I'm trying to decide, is this ADHD or is this brain fog during menopause, and particularly brain fog that's not just memory. It's kind of got a bit of that inattention and difficulty with organization and decision making. So if it's something that's new onset, so it really wasn't there and it started to emerge in perimenopausal years, and they're just brand new symptoms, they're not there always, they might be exacerbated by poor sleep, for example, or maybe not, they might just be there, but they're new onset, and there's really no history of someone having those challenges from childhood years, then based on our diagnostic criteria as it stands, ADHD requires that the symptoms and characteristics are there prior to the age of 12. So it's childhood in its onset. And so that's what we're sitting with at the moment with our diagnostic criteria. So it's really speaking a lot to people if things like school reports are available. Sometimes that can be helpful, but sometimes not, because if it's that inattentive presentation and people have really done a lot of masking and done their best to present like they don't have ADHD, then sometimes that's not completely telling. But if it's always been there and it's a true ADHD, that there is a sense of that happening throughout the life. And it might be that people will misdiagnose with depression or with anxiety. Often that's what the history looks like. But there is a history, whereas that new onset is just, it's something that's just emerged in recent years or in the perimenopausal years, and it's more likely to be consistent with brain fog and less likely to cause a significant impairment in different aspects of life. Even though it might have an impact on people, it might not cause the same degree of impairment as what you might expect to see in ADHD.
For sure. Yeah, totally get it. I mean, I think a lot of women tell us that they feel brushed off when they raise concerns about memory or focus, whether or not they have ADHD. I mean, how can women advocate for themselves and be taken seriously if they're trying to get help in this space?
Yeah, I think it's really important that people are validated. It's a very real experience, the symptom of brain fog. So while there are things that people experience, whether you're male, female, any life phase, like we all have times where we feel foggy, where we can't remember things. They're not uncommon symptoms, but all the research shows that for women in particular, they peak during perimenopausal years. So it's significantly higher during that time, that the degree of those everyday memory problems, attention problems, that subjective experience of brain fog is much more common during perimenopause. And we also know from lots of studies that have been done all around the world that about 2/3 of women experience brain fog during perimenopausal years. So it's really common. You're more likely to experience it than not. But the degree or the spectrum of severity varies. So for some people, it's not so bothersome. But for a lot of women, it's really quite bothersome. And I think then, if people build up the courage to approach a healthcare provider or their GP to talk about it and they get brushed off, that's an awful experience, because then you feel like it's all in your head and you're making it up. So I think it's just kind of important that women are reassured that this is really common, that you can experience brain fog. Most women do to some extent during the perimenopausal years. I think another really important thing for women to know, and the general public to know, is that also when we do more detailed neuropsychological assessment of people's core cognitive skills, so people's ability to reason and to think and problem solve and use their memory, and when the setting is structured in a way that people can perform at their best, perimenopausal women don't have true cognitive impairments. There's not a significant decline in cognition. And I think that's really important, because we don't want to assume that just because someone's perimenopausal that they're not able to perform cognitively, they're not able to function. That's not the case. But the reality is that a lot of women struggle day to day with aspects of their thinking skills and might need some sort of support.
Okay, well, let's get practical then. If someone's struggling with menopause brain or menopause brain plus ADHD, what evidence-based strategies do actually help?
Good question. So evidence-based and practical solutions, there's a bit of a difference. We did review the literature to have a look, what is out the evidence, what's the scientific evidence for different strategies during menopause, and there's not a lot of studies. But from what we do know, the teaching of strategies is the best, or the cognitive tool that has the best evidence base. So strategies are things like using external supports to support your memory. So things like electronic diaries, or using your phone for creating external structure to support your memory. So not trying to rely on holding everything in your head, because our working memory, which is like how much we can juggle in our head at any one time, that's capacity limited. So if it's completely full, things drop off. So getting as much as you can out of your head, and then sort of organizing your week, your day, using to-do lists, breaking down tasks, prioritizing tasks on paper or in an electronic format. They're really good strategies to just try and clear some working memory space so you can focus on the task at hand, and the task can be broken down so you can focus on, chunks of tasks. So using those kind of strategies have got an evidence base as at helping day-to-day memory, attention, decision-making, problem-solving, those kinds of abilities.
Yeah, so I need to really make that shopping list instead of just going to Woolies and relying on my memory, which is probably why I always feel so exhausted in the afternoon and completely incapable of making a decision.
Yes, exactly. The other thing I do often talk about is the evidence base for lifestyle changes that people can make, or lifestyle optimization for cognition and for brain health. So there is a really decent and growing body of evidence that shows what we can do with our lifestyle to help our brains, that in turn helps our cognition, helps our mood, and also helps us to ensure we minimize our risk of later life cognitive decline. So I think sort of menopause, midlife is such a great time to implement and reflect on our lifestyle. So what we know is that exercise has huge benefits for brain health, for mood, for cognition. And the World Health Organization guidelines are 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week, plus 2 sessions, if you can, per week of some sort of strength training. So that's kind of what you're aiming for. But I think just get moving in some way. If you're someone who does no exercise, don't try and suddenly hit the optimal level. Just do something that you are happy enough to do, and sort of really gradually build up an exercise routine. Sleep is also really important, and it's, it's easy to say, but I know for a lot of people it's really challenging to get good sleep, particularly during perimenopause. But there is a lot of different resources and help that people can seek out if you're struggling with sleep. So whether that's sort of hormone therapies or melatonin, or there's cognitive training, so cognitive behavior training for insomnia, if it's insomnia that someone's experiencing. So sleep is really important to address. Diet is another one. There's a lot of evidence base now for the Mediterranean diet as being the best for brain health. And all of these things, it's the same for heart health as it is for brain health. So it's just good for your body, good for your mind, your soul. Social connection, again, growing evidence base that loneliness contributes to depression, whereas if you're feeling socially connected, that's good for cognition, preventing or minimizing your risk of later life cognitive decline, so promoting cognitive health. So, I think when we get really busy, sometimes those social things can drop off, but they're also really important. And the other one is not using alcohol as a coping strategy. So that's not going to be helpful for your brain. So trying to really minimize alcohol intake is also really important.
Absolutely. Yes, these are things that help with so many symptoms of menopause across the board. Same things that keep coming up. Now, for women, for women already taking ADHD meds, does this life stage mean adjusting doses or expectations? And also, how does HRT or MHT work into this? Can they complement each other?
So there's actually no evidence or research clinical studies that have looked into this question. The only things we know for sure is that for women across the menstrual cycle who have ADHD, a lot of women report that in that premenstrual phase where estrogen's a bit lower, progesterone's a bit higher, their ADHD or stimulant medication is less effective. So some women have an increased dose of their stimulants during that phase of the menstrual cycle if they're sensitive to the hormone changes and they find that beneficial. So we don't know across the menopause, no one's kind of reported on this, what happens to the effects of stimulant dosing. And in terms of hormone therapy, again, no one's done any research to look at this, but anecdotally, a lot of women report that hormone therapy can really help a lot of the symptoms that they're experiencing, sort of mental health symptoms, ADHD symptoms, but there's no evidence base to support this. And so I think we need a bit more research to really get that evidence base to build up. But I think it's always important for people just to chat to their psychiatrist, GP, whoever they're working with about the different options, try things, keep some sort of track on your symptoms so you know what's working, what's not. and kind of have to advocate for yourself and reflect on your own progress a little bit, because we don't have a really good evidence base to follow at this point in time.
Yeah, fair enough. So now we hear a lot about, the long-term effects of menopause on brain health and the cognitive decline that can come later. For women with ADHD, is there an extra layer of risk when it comes to things like memory or mental health later in life?
So again, there's a little bit of evidence that shows people, not specifically women, but people with ADHD are at a higher risk of cognitive decline later in life. And then we also know that females are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease later in life as well. So I guess if you put these two things together, although there isn't clear evidence, but if you put those two things together, I think if you're a female with ADHD, your risk is going to be slightly elevated for a later life dementia risk. But I think there's also the evidence that's emerging about all these lifestyle things that we can do to bring down that risk. Potentially hormone therapy, but we don't really know, is another factor that might help alter that risk. So I think doing what you can, the things that are in your control, is great to try and reduce that risk and ensure that you can be at your best for as long as possible.
For sure. And finally, what changes would you love to see in research or clinical care so women sort of aren't left to figure all this out on their own?
I think exactly what you've just asked me, Zoe, the questions I can't answer because they're not in the literature. So I would love to see really good clinical trials that have a look at hormone therapy, stimulant use, the interaction between these in women during the perimenopause transition. I think that would be so helpful for so many women just to know what the different options are and how they might change their ADHD symptoms or improve their all their symptoms that they might be experiencing. So I would love to see a little bit more or some research. There's absolutely nothing. So we're doing a little bit. We're starting a little bit of research in this space. So we're hoping to add something to, the evidence base is out there, but I'd love to see a whole lot more.
Okay, so finally, for the woman listening right now who keeps losing her keys, can't remember why she walked into the kitchen, what's one reassuring or practical thing that you'd want her to take away from today?
I think to know that you're not alone, to know that many women experience that, and it's something that a lot of women go through, and that if you really need to use your brain, just know that your brain is still going to work for you. You just need to focus on one thing at a time. So you're often walking into a room and forgetting why because your mind's elsewhere. And so just try and reduce how much you're juggling inside your head at any one time so you can try and focus on whatever task you're doing at that moment.
Yeah. Close a few tabs, stop multitasking.
Yes, exactly. Close the tabs. I like it. Yes.
Okay. Well, I hope today's conversation has reassured you that brain fog, forgetfulness or focus issues in menopause are not a sign you're losing your mind. They're a very real part of what happens when our hormones shift. So a huge thanks, Caroline Gurvich, Associate Professor Caroline Gurvich, for sharing your expertise on women's brain health and ADHD during this important life stage.
Thank you very much, Zoe.
If you found this episode helpful, please like, review and share it with a friend who might be navigating the same challenges. And for more great advice on living your best life at midlife, be sure to pick up a copy of Prevention magazine. I'm Zoe Mernier. See you next time.